Okay, yeah, you're also on the live stream now. Yeah, so you're ready to go. You can start.
Good afternoon. My name is Andrzej Ancygier, and we are welcoming you from Berlin and many other places. Today we'll present a new perspective on trying to decarbonize the very challenging sector, the passenger transport sector. And I will start presenting, but we will also have presentations by our excellent guests. We will start with perspective from Lithuania by Kristina Gaučė from the House Centras. We will also have introduction on some best practices from Raul Cazan from TEDiT in Romania. And last but not least, we will take you to Poland about Piotr Chrzanowski from Visa Europe. I would start by saying a few words about the tool that we developed in the framework of a project financed by the EUKI, by the European Climate Initiative, the tool offers to present to develop a much more comprehensive perspective on strategies on how to decarbonize the transport sector, at the same time promote an increase in mobility levels. The rationale between the the TEDiT tool was developed when we looked at the main challenges that the policymakers are facing when designing policy framework for passenger transport. First of all, there is some lack of policy relevant data. There is quite a lot of data, no doubt about it, but the data is sometimes challenging to operationalize. So the policymakers are not quite sure what to do with this data, how to react in terms of policies. The data may also be spread across different places and cover different sectors, subsectors. So what we did try to do in this tool as well is to harmonize the data sources and to come up with a comprehensive information for each lever that I will mention in a second. And some data is not available at all, and that's especially challenging for walking and cycling, two modes of transport that we have to promote if we want to decarbonize our transport sector. Another challenge that policymakers are facing is time pressure. So they usually working under very intensive work pressure, and therefore they do not have enough time to look at different studies, different best practices. So this is why in our project Beyond Best Practices, we would like to make very concrete suggestions on how certain drivers of emissions from the transport sector can be addressed. They also do not really know how to close certain policy gaps. So best practices are there, but how to use them in the policy framework, in the policy architecture that is driving emissions reduction. And finally, because of this time pressure, the suggestions and policies that are introduced and developed address the same levers. This is especially the case when we look at emissions intensity of passenger cars. It does need to be addressed, no doubt about it, but we are ignoring many other levers that can also play an important role in reducing emissions from the passenger transport sector. For example, activity levels or load factors. And there is also misalignment between effort and outcome. For example, we do pay a lot of attention to emissions intensity of passenger transport, passenger vehicles, but we do not pay too much attention to the activity levels and load factors as well. So as a result, we decided to disaggregate the main drivers of emissions. We looked at the 9 modes of transport. So here you can see them to the right, that's passenger cars, obviously, buses, motorcycles. We also covering aviation, domestic, international, walking, cycling, trams, and subway. For almost all of those modes of transport, we also identified 3 levers. So for those emitting ones, we look at the activity levels in passenger kilometers per year annually. We look at emissions per vehicle, and we look at how many people are in this vehicle, because the eureka moment that was the driving argument for this project and for this approach was a realization that if in Poland, the load factor of passenger cars were kept at the same level in 2019 as in 2000, emissions from transport sector would have increased half as fast. And no one really worried about the fact that we will have cleaner cars, but traveling much more often and being much bigger and emptier at the same time. So this was one of the main driving forces behind the project. We provided the values for the levers for 2000 to 2019, and the users can select values for 2030 and 2050 to develop their own scenarios and their own assessment of what is providing the biggest impact in terms of policy action. Changing the values of the different levers will immediately show the impact on emissions levels and mobility. We will show it that in a second. And we developed a tool for Hungary, Lithuania, Poland, Romania, and the EU. However, it can be adapted for many other countries and many other levels as well. And almost every lever is accompanied with a list of policy measures that can shift the values of the levers in the desired direction, so that there's the connection between data and between policy measures that can be introduced. Now, let me take you to the tool itself that you can see and you can find under this link. And this is the front page. And again, we are also welcoming any suggestions and ideas. How can we further make this tool useful for policymakers and stakeholders? Let me take you, for example, to Poland. And these are some of the values that we developed. So this is the starting point. We received values to 2019. The reason why we decided to go for 2019 is because it's before the pandemic. So 2020 is already a different year and one that is extraordinary for many different reasons. And the availability for data for 2021 is not there yet. So this may change in the future. For now, our base year is 2019. So what we do is we just harmonize this all to 2019 levels. And we decide, for example, can figure out and develop a scenario in which Poles travel slightly less by car in 2030 and much less in 2040 and 2050. The cars may be slightly fuller in 2030, and at the same time, they may stay rather empty in 2050 because of, for example, autonomous cars. Emissions, let's assume they will decrease quite radically, and we'll have mostly carbon neutral cars by 2050. These are the cars on the road, not the cars that are currently sold. So this is slightly different than the emission standards. We can do this for all the 21 levers that we identified, actually. I will just suggest also going to railway, where we do have some, let's say, modest increase in 2030, and then let's assume rapid development of faster trains, and 2050 we will have much higher activity levels for this mode of transport. And at the same time, maybe aviation would be much less popular. Obviously, domestic aviation would be closely to non-existing in 2030, 2050, and we may assume that international aviation would reduce slightly in 2030 and much more in 2050 because of some alternative modes of transport. These are just ideas that you may come up with, but you can see immediately here the impact of this scenario, very preliminary scenario on mobility and on emissions. So by 2030, emissions would be decreased by 53%, 2050 by 82%. But keep in mind, we didn't really play with all the levers. That's something that can be easily done. And mobility would decrease much less. We have to differentiate between mobility that is welcomed and for leisure, for example, and mobility that is maybe less welcomed, like commuting to work. So this is the way the tool looks like. I will come back to this website in a second, but just continuing with the explanation, what TEDiT can do actually. First of all, it can help to identify gaps and overlaps in policies addressing emissions from passenger transport. So this is something that policymakers, when developing a scenario, can ask themselves. Is there a policy that could drive emissions reduction by addressing respective lever? Did I only cover those policies that's been introduced in other policies or something that we've dealt before? But what about load factor, for example? What about the activity levels? Can we do something about those drivers of emissions? So this is something that policymaker can think about using our tool to make the policy framework much more comprehensive. Another point, another question that they can ask themselves is, has too much attention been given to certain lever at the cost of another one? And that's a question that may result in shifting of resources that are limited, for example, from promoting electric vehicles towards, for example, development of other cleaner modes of transport like railway or walking and cycling. What TEDiT can also do, and that's something that you've just seen live, is support developing drafts of emission reduction scenarios. We do not expect TEDiT to be the final destination for developing national transport strategies, but we expect this to be the starting point for such strategies, something that the stakeholders could think about that they wouldn't have thought without this tool. Here you have something that I've just done on the tool. For example, if you reduce activity levels for passenger cars, if you have the emissions of the vehicles on the road for cars, for buses, if you increase the load factor and you return it to 2000 levels, and you move 500 kilometers from aviation to rail, the emissions would decrease by 59% and mobility by only 11%. So this is something that is showing you the impact of different measures. And finally, what we also do, what the tool does, is provide initial ideas on how to shift the values in the desired direction. This takes me again to the tool. Almost each lever is accompanied with a link to the list of some best practices. So what you have here are exactly the levers. And what we can have here to the right, for example, is the best practices that can drive emissions and drive the levers in the expected direction. So how do I increase activity for railways, hoping that this will reduce emissions and activity levels for the highly intensive modes of transport like aviation or cars? These are some of the options. Night trains, for example, excellent way to reduce emissions from trains, from transport sector. That's something that's been discussed already. Reduce tickets, taxes. Keep in mind, this is also a short description of the policies, something that we develop using already existing resources. This is answering the question, the challenge that policymakers are facing of not having enough time to look into all the studies that were published, but we are happy to refer to existing studies here and provide links. So this is just starting base for the policymakers to save the time, to increase efficiency of the policy strategies, and also to use already existing studies that, again, we can happily add to this website. So these are initial ideas. What TEDiT cannot do, just to be frank about it as well, is we do not really quantify the impact of these policy measures on emissions. We don't do it because it would be too challenging and would be way beyond the scope of the project. For example, taxation of international aviation, increasing taxation would have different impact on the activity levels for aviation in Poland, in Romania, would result in modal shift between different modes of transport depending on the development of railway, for example. Then this would result in shift from aviation, from air to rail. In other cases, it may increase road transport. So the quantification is not there. The best practices, or the practices, not always best, show you how do we get in this direction, but do not show you how far you will go. For this, more in-depth studies would be needed, and this is topic for another project, in fact. We also didn't compare the selection with another future scenarios. This was driven by the desire to keep this tool simple and understandable, and again, it's the beginning of designing a strategy for a given country, and to look into certain options that could have been looked into in the policy framework. And last but not least, we also, the tool is only prepared for national level. The tool can be adapted to the city level, depending on the city, depending on the amount of data. And the certain data is easier available at the city level, for example, for cycling and walking, and other data is only available at national level. But what we would be glad to do is to share information or share their Excel file and the whole idea, how does it work, with interested stakeholders. Just let us know. We can also happily talk to you and provide explanation how this tool can be adapted to the specific city or to the circumstances of other countries. Now, the remaining 4 presentations will go into specifically how do we deal with the best practices. Just last point I would like to address is the issue of the model shift. So we are addressing the issue of model shift indirectly in the tool. This is why we include and promote increasing activity for railway. Increasing activity for railway will increase emissions slightly because not all railway is zero carbon. However, this is something that will hopefully drive emissions or decrease activity levels for highly emitting modes of transport like aviation or road transport. Obviously, even if walking and cycling do not emit anything, we do hope that moving to this mode of transport will decrease activity levels for emitting modes of transport. So this is how we cover model shift. And the policymakers, stakeholders on the ground will be able to better assess what impact this increasing activity for low carbon means of transport will have on highly intensive modes of transport like flying or driving. Now we will have 3 presentations dealing with specific best practices, broader framework from Lithuania. So Kristina, over to you.
Thank you, Andrzej, and hello everyone. I'm happy and proud to be here and to present a little bit of practice from Lithuania, which is not very local based, and it's rather a holistic approach than localized best practices, but I hope it fits to our content and format today. So if you could go to the next slide, Andrzej, I would like a little bit with just a few words to describe, let's say, problematic and a question which we are trying to address with new spatial approach in Lithuania. So I don't know how much it's relevant to another countries in our neighborhood and in whole Europe, but in Lithuania, public transport, which basically needs to carry persons to commute daily, it is very, very much, how to say, limited by boundaries, administration boundaries of cities and regions and districts. Public transport it's traveling to, that leads us to not having unified ticket, to not having combined timetables, to not having enough multimodality options, and of course altogether that leads to how Andrzej said already, to very unfriendly and very unsustainable model shift between trips among passengers. So in Lithuania, we designed until 2050, Andrzej, next slide, please, a spatial concept which already is addressing transportation needs not by administrative borders of districts or regions, but really connecting and addressing functional needs of people to commute to work, to study, for cultural, for business, and other trips on daily basis. That basically means that, and it's really difficult to solve with, especially with Ministry of Internal Affairs and Financial Ministry. But this question basically needs that different regions with different parts of the regions need to agree and to develop a common transportation system, which would cover public transport, all the modes, railway and buses and coaches, as well as multimodality points to change, or even to provide mobility as a right option for very, very not densely urbanized areas. So there are more questions and challenges than solutions, but we are working already on this topic, and we are trying some pilot projects, city plus region or city plus another city, to see how it's possible to connect all the system into the whole public transport and multimodality hub, but not to have separate things. Of course, possibilities in the whole country, they are not equal. And as elsewhere, we have very dense urbanized areas with a lot of need for commuting, and we have less urbanized area for less commuting, and of course for economical reasons, less economical reasons to provide very frequent public transport, for example, in those areas. So what we are suggesting and what we are trying to implement, and we already tried it in Vilnius case, I will speak a few minutes later about it. We think that a whole area cannot be served equally with the same quantity and quality of, for example, public transport, but it can have some hierarchy where you collect people from very low urbanized areas, and with short reader, you bring them to moderate efficiency zone, and then people can change to already frequent and convenient public transport and go to very high efficiency zone where public transport works much better than private car. So that is the concept. And next slide, please. And as I said, we tried already to put it in a place in Vilnius with the idea of sustainable urban mobility plan and local master plan. We already trying to implement this hierarchy public transport system in the city. We have some fast routes. We have main routes of buses and trolley buses, and we are suggesting to have shuttle service from collecting people from suburbs and bringing them to those main and fast routes. And the idea is to have short reader, but to have frequent and convenient and reliable public transportation, so people can connect easily to the places we need. But also another important thing that in city already you can easily to implement idea of multimodality, and we have some pilot projects like multimodality points where you can come with your bicycle, for example, your first or last mile, you can come with your bicycle or scooter to store it safely in the storage room, and then go with fast public transport bus, for example. And we also are connecting all the systems into the same places: shared bicycle, shared scooters, shared cars, park and ride system, and every measure are trying to be connected to people and to the city infrastructure. So it addresses all the issues. Next slide, please. This idea of Vilnius came, as I already mentioned, it basically was addressed and picturized in our sustainable urban mobility plan for Vilnius, but Vilnius is not the only city which has it. And I would like to, I know that it happened in Romania and Poland and Hungary and all the European countries as well, but for such small country as Lithuania, they have 20 sustainable urban mobility plans. Is quite a challenge, and nice challenge, which was already addressed. So what we have for first, and I would like also to connect it to this holistic approach and holistic holistic hub for best practices and cases to address climate change and transportation needs. So what we had first is it was guidelines for sustainable urban mobility plans. They were something in between from European guidelines, which were adopted a little bit earlier, and something between Lithuanian practice and culture of planning. So those guidelines were accepted quite well, and 20 cities and towns now we have sustainable urban mobility plans. Next slide, please. For those, I do not believe that there is a single person in audience which doesn't know sustainable urban mobility plan concept, content, idea, and outputs. But still, if there is at least one person, just briefly to mention, sustainable urban mobility plans also connects as planning for people and planning for daily and episodic people needs to travel in the city and to do it as much as possible sustainably with less impact to the climate change. So these plans are answering different questions: cycling, public transport, walking, low emission zones, parking policy, and the rest, like social infrastructure layout, and a lot of many questions too. But main result which sustainable urban mobility plans wants to achieve is, of course, again, as Andrzej said at his presentation, is to achieve changes in model split for the city or for entire country. So in Vilnius, we have a successful plan which was being implemented and started to have some changes, but then as in the whole world, COVID came and all the fingers, public transport dropped and but walking raised and so on. But the main thing to say about SUMPs and the impact and possible impact on climate change, that is, if people are owning those plans, as it happened in Vilnius, I believe, then people are not allowing the politicians to make environmentally unfriendly decisions, which is, I think, very good. And even without or with data, it proves that it's effective measure to go. Next slide, please. So regarding evaluation and data-driven policy, I did not want to say any sad things about implementation of those plans, but one thing which I think needs to be mentioned, it's monitoring. Implementation happens, but as I put slide with Vilnius, you can see in this middle of the picture in the middle that normally, I don't know why, but I know why, but normally measures with low priority are in place and with high priority are in place. And those measures which are in middle, which are really difficult to implement, which really needs a high political acceptance and support, which are expensive, or sometimes they are for free, but we need some big changes. Somehow those measures are not implemented, and in 2 years from now, it's already more than 3 years after Vilnius Sustainable Urban Plan was adopted, we monitored results of it, and now we can see how many measures in which topic we implemented, but still we do not have this evidence with effect on climate change, which possibly those measures did. So, and when we were planning, we didn't have this tool like TEDiT to test which measure could be mostly effective and should be prioritized and implemented first. So so I believe for those who will be doing SUMPs in the next future, and if they will be able to adopt TEDiT for city level, that will be great tool. Doesn't matter which lever it covers. Next, and I think last slide. Next slide, almost last slide. Just to mention also that implementation and effect on climate change, it doesn't really depends only on finances, but it very depends much on the owner. As I said, in Vilnius case, community is owning plan itself, but it's not implementing. But what else we have? We have municipal enterprise, which covers all the topics which were mentioned in the Vilnius plan. It covers parking policy, it covers public transport, it covers shared vehicles, it covers infrastructure for bicycles, parking rights, multimodality points, and so on. So when implementation is in one hand, in one couple of hands or one entity, it leads to success, and that is something I'm happy about. And last slide, Andrzej, please. And showing this connection, I don't know if I was successful to show this connection, but my point was to show that from national policy, which is spatial and rather spatial than strategic, from national policy, having different mobility zones, localizing ideas in city level within SUMPs, it's like snowball. First of all, it's small, but then it leads to numerous of guidelines, policies, monitorings, discussions, political changes, and so on. And we are just about to approve updates for new guidelines for sustainable urban mobility plans, and also guidelines for low emission zones, which I think is also effect of the work we are doing in projects like this. I know I took a few minutes more. Sorry, guys.
No worries. That is excellent and definitely worth it. Thank you very much, Kristina. Raul, now Raul will take us to Romania. Over to you, Raul.
Thank you. First of all, I need to tell you that Romania makes a special case all the time in all matters related to policies and politics altogether. I can start with a short story right now. 10 years ago, we had, as 2 Celsius with some partners, we had pushed into the parliament and actually passed a law on green public procurement. And it actually went through, and today Romania has a central law on green public procurement for the mere reason that we pushed it with many NGOs from all over Romania. Most countries don't do that. I mean, it doesn't make any sense because this is a purely local initiative. So basically everybody from local administrations, local governments, whatever, are supposed to do that by themselves. I mean, this is what green public procurement is. You respect some standards and you apply them because it's commonsensical, kind of. Romania is not commonsensical. And this is how we got to the part of low emission zones. And we noticed, we observed that in not a single Romanian city, with one exception, but this is much more recent, with the exception of Cluj-Napoca, cities did not have low emission zones whatsoever. So then we were wondering, what the hell can we do about this thing, you know, since we identified 3 ways, 3 big ways, 3 paths by which we can go to that. They were kind of like, you know, places to test everything. And first one is to have a sump, right? I mean, you have low emission zones in the Sustainable Urban Mobility Plan, but Sustainable Urban Mobility Plans didn't really have them. Then, like in the UK or even in Germany, you can take the municipality to court, and via court decision, you can have some, or, you know, make it some sort of an obligation for the municipality to create low emission zones in the city, which is possible, and it's been very successful, again, in Germany and in the UK. Again, via court, this is the second. And the third, make a law. So how can we make a law? I mean, did anyone do that? And actually, we realized that there was a model at European level, is the Dutch model. The Dutch actually made a law that is related to low emission zones. How did we get there is very interesting. And why we need that? Well, first of all, is because most especially in the last couple of years, even the Romanian institutions that are usually very opaque opened up, and suddenly we realized that the emissions of dust, so PMs, right, 2.5 and 10, and then NOx and SOx and carbon monoxide and everything were extremely high. What you have in this picture is actually official data from recently. Anyway, I don't exactly remember the day, but I just made a capture and I'm showing it to you. And I put the little, you know, smoke clouds over them. Now let's go to the second slide. I'm going to brag a little on everything that we tried as 2 Celsius, as an organization, in order to improve the whole thing related to low emission zones. And first of all, we created networks in Romania by which we can measure. So that was before the time when the state institution, the National Authority for Environmental Protection, actually started to measure properly values. We had a Romanian version of Luftdaten. I guess everybody knows Luftdaten. It was shocking stuff that we got, most especially in Bucharest, and most especially in PMs values, which were, you know, overpassing limits 10 times. And then we created even more professional, so to say. So that means that we put a lot of money into sensors in a network which is called AirLive. And this is very accurate, and it started to be very respected by the state institutions, and actually take it as true values of air quality. At the same time, we studied a case against Bucharest by which we tried to cancel the sustainable urban mobility plan for the simple reason that it had absolutely no indicators related to emissions, first of all, and second of all, no way of monitoring all that. It wasn't a strong case for us, but adding up the fact that we weren't consulted in any way, or the civil society wasn't consulted in any way, we won. So basically what we managed to do last year was to cancel this in court. And right now, Bucharest is without a sustainable urban mobility plan, but it's going to come up in a couple of months, and no, in 1 month actually, and we're being consulted constantly. And this is the good news, which takes us to the next slide, in which I explain with a lot of words, and this is the most boring slide that you could possibly see. I don't usually do that, but basically what we started to do is to find progressive MPs in the Romanian parliament. And it's a lot of them. For our surprise, it was plenty of them. We weren't expecting to have so many. And they started over with this sort of legal initiative to make a low emission zone law. And with this law, which will be mandatory on the whole territory of Romania, the local administrations, local governments will take it as a legal framework and actually implement by law and mandatorily low emission zones in their respective territories. Now, at this point, the law is in the Committee of Environment in the Romanian Senate. It's going to pass. It's going to be read in the plenary very soon, again in June. And I don't know exactly how the legal draft looks like right now, but like until a week ago, it identified the concrete evidence of the local problem in the first articles. I mentioned here major local pollutants. We mentioned the extent and the extent of the congestion problem in respective cities, the local demographics and the way the cars are flowing into the locality, and the public priorities around the air quality in general in that local municipality. Now, there are also rules and stuff that is already being discussed about public participation and access routes and exceptions that are supposed to be done, say, to ambulances or supply chains or whatever. But the thing is that at this point, we're at the stage in which we're going to most probably have a law that imposes low emission zones, stuff that it hasn't been done so far. Only in the Netherlands. I must say that because for me, it's like not a legal, but a legislative experiment, really. And I hope it's going to be successful. But coming back to the Dutch, well, they didn't do like Romanians. They didn't create a framework top down, but they did it bottom up. I mean, they had so many laws all over the country that they needed to, establish some rules altogether, and they centralized the rules eventually just to give them some sort of a fluency. Well, Romania is going to be bottom up. Usually it goes like that for the simple reason that social capital is pretty weak. There is administrative capacity, which is at a very, very low point. And sometimes we have to surpass, for environmental reasons, local initiatives. Can we go to the next slide, please? The most important thing at this point is to prepare a calendar for all this. And basically, this is a calendar which is like both for petrol and diesel, which is like pretty much shared by everybody, say in Europe. At this point, the region of Brussels is doing this very thing, that they're phasing out slowly in the, so to say, acceptance of different sorts of engines and cars with certain amounts of emissions. Usually these emissions are related to Euro, but there are also CO2 emissions that are being considered in other localities, which is something very interesting to consider. So basically, we are thinking of establishing systems of monitoring, control, review, and enforcement, which are like going to be implemented at local levels and carried out by means of central government and power. So this is the first good practice that I wanted to present to you. It was too long probably, but the next one I'm going to make it shorter because again, the big it's not a special case Romania here, but it's like a very simple case. I mean, the simplicity that entangles Romania in this matter is painful, for the reason that we have a Romanian paradox that I'm defining right here. Unfortunately, you cannot see the arrow, but it's like at this point, there are regional trains that are functionable and they work, they carry people, passenger trains, of course, on electrified railways. However, they work on diesel. And to me, this is probably the most absurd situation. It's not even, it's not, you wouldn't even spend, time to justify anything like that, because in quantitative terms, obviously the emissions are massive, but in qualitative terms, it's simply ridiculous. So when it comes to the very simplicity of the problem in Romania, well, that problem relies in the fact that the big problem lies in infrastructure and rolling stock. So basically, most investments have to go into this. It's pretty simple. Why? Well, that is 30 years ago, Romania was pretty well off when it came to electrified lines in the whole network system of Romania. But ever since, so we're talking about 4 decades of, I would say, misconduct and something that is tangential to probably criminal activity from the part of the government that literally destroyed most part of the rail network of Romania, ended up in trains attending at speed of 55 kilometers an hour on average. Well, the average, if you add even the faster trains, goes to 68 kilometers an hour. Night trains are pretty much almost inexistent, with 2 probably mentionable examples, one to Timișoara from Bucharest and the other one from Bucharest towards Baia Mare via Cluj, which is pretty good. But suddenly domestic flights are gathering pace, which is absolute madness, for the simple reason that we're talking about distances of 600, 700 kilometers covered by an airplane, which are normally distances that are supposed to be covered by trains. Road transport, however, is the only option at this point. And thank you, Andrzej. You're speeding me up. I'm going to continue this bragging also in the fact that we are also partners in Europe on Rail. It's another EUKI sponsored project. And it's where we are coming up with good practices, pretty well drawn for the Romanian state that is supposed to get involved into this. And what we are proposing is actually at the European level to get, loans from the European Investment Bank, if it's possible. We are proposing something, I would say, revolutionary or crazy, and that is to have a rolling stock pool at European level, if that is possible. It's still kind of crazy to understand this, but at this point, it might be possible for transborder trains, hopefully. And we pushed, and many local municipalities, associations pushed to have within the recovery and resilience plan of Romania to have over 5 billion euro invested into railways. Is mostly rolling stock and having more or renewed electrified rails. Also, money could come from Connecting Europe facility. in this point where you don't have electrified rails, we managed to see that what it's called the Authority for Railway Reform, which is a very new agency, pretty much invented recently, but it's a good institutional response if you ask me, is focusing on hydrogen trains, and they're putting a lot of money into it, as they do also in other parts in Europe, most especially in France, as far as I understood. And there we're going to have hydrogen trains starting 2025, 2026 as a response to the lack of electrified lines here and there. The final slide, dear Andrzej, doesn't make any sense anymore, because basically I was supposed to show, I'm doing it, to show the lines that are being renewed there and electrified further. So thank you. That's the two experiments that I proposed to you.
Excellent. Thank you very much, Raul, for that. And before I give over to Piotr, I would just like to connect this perspectives with TEDiT itself, so that the picture is clearer. What we're talking about, why we do it, why do we have different presentations? Just the main point is that all best practices that Kristina and Raul mentioned, and that Piotr will mention in a second, can be linked to one of the levers. So, for example, night trains or lack of those could address the issue of activity levels for railways if we have this night trains again. The electrification of railway tracks, they are electrified, they're just not used. But if you use them electrified railway tracks, that's in emissions intensity of railway tracks. So this again another lever that we have. And going into low emission zones, that's activity for passenger cars, because that would discourage people from using passenger cars. Going to SUMPs and more integrated planning, one of the main levers that would be addressed here would be activity levels for walking and cycling, because if you integrate, especially using public transport with the other modes of transport, that would increase activity for those low carbon alternatives. It's just the main perspective here is, again, just that you can link each of the levers to one of the best practices, which applies also to Piotr's presentation. Piotr, over to you.
Thank you. Good afternoon, everyone. I'm going to show you some information from important from Polish side. So one of the most important documents in Poland in e-mobility development and infrastructure is the Act on E-Mobility, which introduced the goals from local governments in Poland. As you can see on the left side, on the left picture, the implementation of the Act implements some goals from local governments with more than 50,000 inhabitants. So we have share of the zero emission buses in the fleet of the city buses in this city. Now we have to implemented more than 5% of the zero emission buses in our cities. After the new year, it will be 10%. And additionally, we have the next very important document. It's a Polish energy policy, which implemented for the local government with a population over 100,000 inhabitants. Additional obligation. So after 2025, those cities can only buy zero emission buses, and in 2030, public transport will be fully decarbonized in the cities. And what's important in Poland, that the biggest fleet of electric buses in our country has Warsaw. It's more than 160 buses. Only London and Moscow have more buses, electric buses in their fleets in Europe. And if we have this share of zero emission buses in Poland, there are some cities in our country that have done a lot of work. Some kind of city like Jaworzno, which have more than 60% of fleet with zero emission buses, or Zielona Góra, which have almost half of their fleet of buses which are zero emission and electric. For now, we have over 700 electric buses registered in Poland. Only 3 cities have more electric buses on their country, so it's Great Britain, France, and Sweden. And unfortunately, we don't have lots of hydrogen buses. It's connected with no lack of the infrastructure in Poland. We have only one hydrogen station, and it's private, and the owner is one of the Polish TV stations. So it's not public, so it can be used in public transportation. If we talk about the financial for funding the electric buses in Poland, we have 4 large calls for funding for that kind of vehicles. It allowed to finance over 850 buses, and their total budget was almost 3 billion Polish zlotys. As you can see on the table, every kind of financial scheme have lots of funding for electric buses. And unfortunately, many of the funding requests had to be rejected due to a lack of budget. So it shows how popular those kind of transportation system like electric buses are popular in Poland. Can we change the slide? Okay. So what we have to do to change the implementation and reduce the environmental impact on the transport is, first of all, is a change in the generation of the electricity mix. So we know that Polish have one of the most fossil fuel market, and it's really important in the context of the war in the Ukraine. So we know that we have to reduce the import of the fossil fuels from Russia. What's the next important thing is create a sufficient infrastructure for e-mobility and hydrogen. So we need to create a hydrogen station for buses and develop an infrastructure for electric buses. What's really important, that's a continuation of the government projects like green public transport, as I showed in the previous slide. So create the new funding schemes for smaller communities for finance the purchase of the electric buses. And I think that one of the important thing is increase the domestic potential of the Poland. So Poland is the largest exporter of electric buses in the EU and the largest producer of the batteries for electric vehicles. So this is a big potential for whole Europe and for Poland to become a leader in that type of transportation. And second practice I would like to show you is bike sharing, which have 13 years history in Poland. We have lots of in Poland we have 75 systems in almost 100 cities, which offer almost 22,000 bikes for rent. Last year bike rental have some problems, and the fight with electric scooter rental companies. Now it's more than half of the market, but it's still developing, and half of the all shared bike fleets are available in 4 cities. It's Warsaw, Łódź, Wrocław, and Poznań. And the most popular system based on the rental bikes, based on the length of the bike rides, and first 30 minutes is for rent for free. And what can we do to change it? So it's the first thing that we can change is recovery of the COVID pandemic. We saw in every single company that rental jobs and bicycle rentals, and we need to increase an improvement of the situation and develop the demand of the sector. As I said before, there is a fight with the scooter rental system. It will some situation like popularity of bike rental is lower than in the before they showed on the market. What is important is the expansion of the infrastructure. So we need to create a new bike station in the right location, which will be easier to rent for the citizen. The most important thing is increased safety for cyclists. So improving the security and safety of the people who rent this bike. So bike lanes and the law which can protect the Polish people and bikers from cars. And definitely we must improve the technical quality of the rented bikes. Sometimes it's damaged or we can't rent it because it's impossible. So it's the main information from Poland. I don't want to talk much more because I think we lack of time.
Excellent. Thank you very much, Piotr, for that as well. And obviously, those best practices can also affect certain levers, for example, activity levels for cycling, and so that's and emissions from buses. So thank you very much for that. Thank you, everyone. We do have questions from Daniel Bongard. Thank you very much for the question as well. I will just take the first one. Would it be possible to adapt TEDiT to countries outside of Europe? Yes, very much so. Depending on the data availability, let us know if you would like to get in touch to explain how this Excel file works. How can you operationalize the data? You see my contact details here. The second one goes to Kristina. Thank you for sharing this. Has TEDiT been applied to prepare the SUMPs beyond the EU as well? Did you apply TEDiT for the plan, for the SUMP plan? Kristina?
Yeah, no, unfortunately no, but Vilnius SUMP actually was also data-driven. We have open data for almost everything which is measured in Vilnius, but unfortunately we didn't have TEDiT by that time, and that was missed. As I said, given priorities to measures what solution should be implemented first, we were looking at the impact on health, which was possible to somehow estimate, and economical benefits like saved lives, I don't know, spend money on infrastructure, but we didn't have this environmental indicator, which was pity. But yeah, now we are discussing with Ministry of Transport very widely, and we are creating new system, which I briefly mentioned, and we are discussing how to benefit out of this tool like TEDiT in national system first, and then to load down it to the local cities level.
Excellent, thank you for that. And the last one goes for Raul. What kind of vehicles will be allowed to enter the zones, and what kind of fleet renewal do you expect, Raul?
Okay, I was muted. Sorry about that. The most important thing is to follow the calendar. So the calendar will say that, I'll give you examples. Euro 4 by 2023, 31st of December can enter, and then boom, it's over. That's all there is. And then gradually, for all kinds of cars, with different sorts of engines and emissions, they're gonna be banned slowly. This is how it's happening in Brussels, for example, and it's working out. So Euro 4 is out already, but then Euro 5 will be out by, say, 2024. Euro 6 will go for a little more. And the planning, the whole calendar should go to, say, 2030 in this case, but with the shootout towards 2050 if you want. Now, what kind of fleet renewal I'm expecting? I'm not expecting a certain fleet. I mean, I'm not expecting a car being replaced by other car. I'm expecting that there's a whole change of local philosophy when it comes to mobility, and that is linked to, first of all, electrification and digitalization. And as long as people start using smarter ways, means of transport, such as, say, trams at certain times, or mobility as a service, so using cars that are available for a certain time and for a certain distance. And also, I would be also interested in taxing personal cars, private cars, on the actual usage of it. So this is something that also the region of Brussels is trying to do. I don't know if it's going to be possible, but it takes a lot of smart electronic equipment to follow. Because you can have like a big diesel SUV, but drive it like once a month. You know, like an elderly person just goes with that SUV from X to Y once a month. She's visiting her friend, you know. That's why that SUV is not super polluter in the end, you know. So the whole idea, I'm not looking for excuses for SUVs whatsoever, but the whole idea is to actually tax the usage of a car on one hand, and then the other, digitalization and electrification to the max, but not replacing cars. That's dumb, really.
Excellent. Thank you very much for the answers as well. And again, thank the organizers of the Transport Week. It's been a great opportunity to present our new approach. And those of you who still remain and then listen to us, get in touch if you have ideas for best practices that could address some of the levers. We're looking forward to hearing from you. And we're also happy to share all the information regarding TEDiT and provide kind of maybe quick